Let's dig into our first session, which covers everything we've learned so far at a fairly high level. And we'll revisit the topics that multiple experts spoke about from the past three webinars over the past 4 months. Now, just a quick overview of what the sessions look like. Our series has been called Navigating the Path Forward, and we've explored solutions for smarter grid planning in an increasingly electric transportation future. Now, this is a four-part webinar series, the fourth of which is which you're attending today, and it's targeted to consumer advocates with content tailored for your specific applications, covering a range of EV-related planning topics. In the first webinar, which is called EVs as a Grid Resource, we covered how EVs actually impact grid affordability and stability. In the second one, which is called No Crystal Ball, we covered forecasting practices and data tools that can actually inform better grid planning. In the third and the previous one, which is called Measure Twice, Cut Once, we explored how you can evaluate the timings of investments and related rate impacts. So just briefly, going through some of the high-level takeaways from each of these webinars. I will go through these fairly quickly, but this is just to give you a glimpse of what we covered. If there are any questions, please feel free to leave them in the chat and we'll explore them in detail. And these slides will also be shared with you so you can go over them after the fact. So with the first webinar, we started by recognizing that EV demand is growing and is expected to continue to scale up. And this poses new challenges for grid planning and requires new approaches of meeting this demand and addressing its impacts. We discussed how, when integrated effectively, EVs can provide multiple benefits for the grid as well as for end-use consumers. And we saw multiple examples of how this could work in real life. We explored how planning, when done strategically, can improve both affordability and reliability through approaches like load management and proactive planning, which can in turn increase the cost effectiveness of infrastructure, which at the end of the day provides long-term downward pressure on rates, impacting end-use consumers. In the second webinar, we dove into how using the right kinds of forecasting data and methodologies can encourage better planning and rate outcomes as well. We recognize that EV loads are different. They have distinct end-use characteristics that require new load forecasting methods. We also discussed how forecasts are pretty much always going to be wrong, but with increasing availability of data and new and innovative methods to use it, we can get a much better understanding of what the future of energy demand looks like, where demand is going to be concentrated, and how to plan for it. At the end of the day, we discussed how leveraging these enhanced approaches will improve planning and will prepare the grid for a better future, benefiting both grid stability and reliability, as well as consumers. And we also, dove into how granular forecasting can support advocates in making more informed assessments of utility plans, and how that kind of data can support asking the questions, are the right assumptions being used in load forecasts? Do they reflect realistic charging behavior and driving patterns? Are investments right-sized and targeted? What kinds of rate impacts can we expect from these? And then finally, are equity arguments being taken into consideration, and are costs really aligned with who drives these system impacts? In that webinar, we also got a glimpse of RMI's GridUp tool, which is an example of these bottom-up forecasting tools that gives you a really granular insight into how charging demand from different types of charging sources can look at something as granular as the census block group level. We had Sean Morash from Telos Energy be the expert in that webinar, and he shared multiple sources or resources that can act as supporting tools for consumer advocates as they go through these activities. And as I think we've shared most of these slides before, which contain links to all these resources, but we'll be sharing these as well. In the third webinar, we brought all of this together and spoke about how proactive investments and proactive planning, when implemented well and made in a targeted fashion, can lower long-term costs for all kinds of ratepayers. Now, there's a growing body of analysis from RMI as well as other resources that highlight this opportunity. But we also recognize that the implementation details and the actual approaches here matter greatly. At a high level, leveraging a proactive planning approach will generally lead lower cost outcomes because of it just being a better planning outcome than a sequential or say waiting for load letters to show up or investing sequentially in infrastructure, that kind of approach. And we also spoke about how the risks of over and under building can be asymmetrical, and how proactive construction or proactive investment can present a lower risk approach, even if asset utilization may look lower in the initial few months or initial few years of proactive investment. But then, the question really becomes, how do we implement this effectively, and what do we take into account when designing these proactive investment approaches? This is where we dove into the charged proactive investment framework that includes the design questions and investment considerations that need to be taken into account. And these range from the life cycle cost impact of investments, the risk of underutilized assets, cost recovery risks, customer connection delays, the risk of not aligning with policy goals, and then finally, the complexity of actually executing these projects. And the final topic of the previous webinar dove into how do we, actually install guardrails around proactive investment and ensure that cost allocation and recovery approaches are appropriate. And we spoke about these 4 approaches here, where we recognize that setting up productions in advance is probably the most useful, along with designing cost recovery that mitigates risk and building in flexibility and approaches that can be adaptive to conditions as they changed, while also having back-end tools that can be a backup plan to manage residual risk as it appears. Now, I know this was a lot of content, but we are happy to share more detailed slides on this that you can refer to for material that we shared in the past. Now, finally, we recognize that planning for EVs covers many areas, and we've only highlighted some of the key pieces through these past 3 webinars. Now, we are planning a future resource here that will dig into a few of these pieces in even more detail, and will have access to some tools and resources that can support consumer advocates and future planning activities. Some of the topics that this resource will cover are on the screen in front of you, ranging from EV charging forecasting to investment planning and approaches, affordability, load management practices, and finally, equitable access to charging. We'll share more on this as this resource comes live, and you can expect to see it in the next couple of months. And with that, I will pass it off to Ben.
Great. Thank you, Aradhana, and thanks everyone for joining us today. For those of you I haven't had a chance to meet, my name is Ben Shapiro. I'm a principal with RMI's transportation program and have had the pleasure of working with a number of consumer advocates as well as some of the leadership at Nasuka in the last couple of years on these topics. As part of that, thought it would be a great way to wrap up this webinar series to invite Nina to join us, who I imagine many of you know. And maybe Nina, I'll ask you to do a brief intro for anyone who doesn't know you in a moment. But as an opportunity to talk about how a lot of this looks from the Nasuka perspective, and maybe more specifically from your personal perspective, Nina, as we enter a fairly different era of grid planning for electric vehicles, for other forms of electrification. Of course, the looming topic that often sucks all the air out of the room with data centers. So I think we'll have a good discussion here. We can probably take the slide down for the moment, if you don't mind. As we do that, Nina, maybe I could ask you to just say a quick hello, brief intro for anyone not familiar with you and your work.
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Nina Suetake. I am the Deputy Director of Policy for the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates. I've been in the utility space as a consumer advocate since about 2004, so I've been around for a while in both California and Washington, and I'm really excited to be able to sit down and chat with RMA today.
Great. Well, we appreciate your time and, of course, your broader engagement with our work in the last couple of years has been wonderful. So just to kick things off, maybe a bit generally, I'd love to hear a little perspective on, with the topic of planning the grid for EVs front of mind, what do you see as the biggest challenges from a ratepayer advocacy perspective in doing so, in planning the grid for these vehicles? And also on the flip side, what do you see as some of the biggest opportunities?
So I think, one of the things is when you think about this from a national perspective, each state is at a different place with both sort of grid planning as well as how sophisticated the utilities are with respect to grid planning and also just working with their advocates. So I think one of the biggest challenges that I see across different offices is whether or not there's any trust built between the utilities and consumer advocates and utilities and their, EV particularly large load EV customers, and then trust with with the commission. It's sort of a multi-layered trust or not trust approach or system. The traditional way of doing things at a commission is fairly adversarial. Utility comes in and says, we want to build, we want to make money, and then it becomes a fight after that. So I think that's a big challenge. And if utilities want to flip that and say, we want to start doing proactive planning and proactive building, they're going to have to do a lot of work to build trust in that area first, I think. So I think that's a big challenge. And then the biggest opportunities, I really, I've seen the data, I've seen the graphs showing, the benefits of proactive managed EV planning, and I would love to see that actually happen. And I feel like it's going to take a while to get there. If that becomes the status quo at I don't know how many years out that we are doing that and actually getting those benefits, I feel like that would be a great opportunity. I'm not sure how long it'll take us to get there,
Yeah, I feel like the temporal questions here, how long does it take to recoup the investment that from certain planning assumptions should net out in sort of net benefits or ratepayers is a huge piece of this. Well, I guess the point about trust is a great one, and certainly in my engagement with different consumer advocate offices and through our couple of convenings, it's become more clear to me how nuanced that relationship is and how different it can look in different places. I think that's also a good segue to the next question here. For those, we've mentioned this throughout the webinar series, but for those not familiar, RMI, along with our colleagues at the Alliance for Transportation Electrification, we have our colleague Elizabeth here who will speak a little bit later today, hosted a couple of convenings with NSUCA and NSUCA members, as well as utility representatives. And we had the pleasure of Nina joining both of those. That was really in large part trying to figure out, given that there isn't always the most trusting relationship, can we create some informal spaces to have those discussions? And I think that I personally found them to be quite productive, and the premise of being able to sort of let your hair down and have an informal dialogue outside of a rate case seemed to be quite valuable. So with all of that as background context, I'm curious to hear how, if at all, your thinking on grid planning for EVs has shifted after having participated in those convenings where we had, I think, a good mix of representatives from different consumer advocate offices across the states. We had, of course, yourself and David from NSUCA, and then we had a sort of different mix of utilities at each of the convenings. So yeah, how has your thinking shifted, if at all, from those experiences?
So I have to admit that when I walked in the door to those things, I had the sort of, again, I'm a little old school, 2004 is a while ago, but I had a very knee-jerk reaction to someone asking us to be okay with proactive spending for something that hadn't materialized yet. It's just not the way I normally think about utility investments. And I have a lot of distrust. But then after sitting through those convenings and looking at more of the data out there, I feel like now I think that the gap between where I was and what could materialize is closer, right? There are definitely issues that need to be resolved, largely forecasting and sort of those guardrails. But I do think that it's possible. There is a world of possible where I used to think no and automatically. So it has changed.
I'm glad to hear that. And, obviously the details matter a lot, but in terms of the assumptions and the forecasting and so forth, but glad to hear that. Sounds like easier to understand the perspective from what is typically viewed as the other side of the table than prior to those discussions. So that's good to hear. Maybe related to that, thinking about those folks that are in the room or across the table, the electric utilities, do you have, if you had to distill what your biggest requests would be for them related to planning the grid for EVs? And I'd say, that can be, we've talked a lot about proactive investment in those convenings and through this webinar series, but not limited to that, just in terms of overall planning for load growth and for these electric vehicles in particular. What sorts of requests do you have for the utilities?
For the utilities, I think if this is something you want to happen, let's focus on proactive. I mean, utilities really have to recognize that proactive spending is a big deal, especially when we're looking at massive affordability challenges across the country. Asking us as consumer advocates to be okay with also proactively spending money on something that hasn't materialized is a big deal. At just, saying, oh, everybody wants EVs, we should just do this now, and treating it like it's just their business as usual isn't going to get this across the finish line. I think they have to really acknowledge that they have to help with the guardrails and to make this palatable to all of the rest of the consumers that are going to be taking on risk. Which, I would argue that's a common theme that I think utilities should be aware of too, that they're not taking this risk. It's always going to be us. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that kind of speaks, again, sort of mapping back onto the convenings. There was a sort of a transition, I think, from the first one, which was largely took place. This was only a little over a year ago, March of 2025, prior to any of the states having too much of a formal stance on how they want to treat proactive investment. And then the second one, which was in January of this year, several states had come forth with actually formalized processes and what will the utilities need to do to sort of justify that this is a good idea. Not to say that everyone in that state agrees it is, but there's been movement there. And so I think there has been some broader recognition of trying to bring the receipts, so to speak, and make these the best thought through options, considering other alternatives as well. So I want to build on that a little bit. That was, I think, your perspective on what would be nice to hear from the utilities, but what about for the regulators? If you were to put yourself, if you're had the floor at a well-attended NARUC meeting, a bunch of the commissioners from different states, what would you want them to hear from the consumer advocate perspective as it relates to EVs?
I'm always urging commissions to make sure that you have consumer advocates in that room. And because it varies greatly from state to state, whether or not consumer advocates are sitting there when the utilities are talking to the commission. Particularly on, outside of litigated proceedings. In that discussion about, hey, we're thinking of doing this from the utilities, the commission should make sure that the consumer advocates have access and are consulted before moving forward with this. I'm always going to ask that about every issue, though. For this specifically, one thing that I'm realizing is that we talk about data centers, the big issue in every room that we talk about now. that everybody is starting to look at this as like, well, they have to have some skin in the game. They have to take on some of the risk. And I'm not sure why we don't also have that conversation with, I'm not talking about like residential, I'm going to put a charger in my house kind of thing, but the big DC fast charging like stations that people want to build, and, and the heavy duty truck EVs and things like that we're pondering. I'm not sure why commissions don't also start thinking about it that way. For those kinds of loads, So, yeah, as much as I think that as a consumer advocate, I can start thinking out a little bit beyond my sort of traditional viewpoint, I think commissions really need to start as well.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable if people need to meet in the middle, right? You don't want that to all be one party sort of coming all the way to the other side of this sort of proverbial table that referencing here. Okay, well, I've asked you about two audiences that aren't really in the room, but what about for the one that is? What do you have to say to your NASUCA membership here in terms of what you've learned here about EV grid planning and any clear strategies that might be useful for them to take as they're thinking about these issues in their own states?
I mean, from my own experience with learning all this stuff, I would say avoid the knee-jerk reaction, but ask a lot of questions. Because again, I keep hammering this, that it's really dependent on the state dynamics. What is the utility? Because there are definitely utilities that are way, I guess I can say, better about consumer protections, and others that are just like, whatever, as long as I get my ROE. But I would urge, the consumer advocates to be open to the idea that there could be benefits from this. I'm not going to say definitely everybody should do proactive planning, but to actually with an open mind, look at what benefits could be possible.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I can't resist the opportunity for a shameless plug here. You mentioned asking a lot of questions and sort of trying to understand what all the assumptions are. We've been trying to share with this audience that RMI has some capacity to provide technical assistance, and that could very much include helping to think through discovery questions and what should you be asking to understand in your rate case, in your distribution system planning proceeding, what have you. So if that sounds useful, I think you all know how to find us at this point. Please do reach out. Okay, but back to this, maybe our last question here, and then I do want to save time for the next panel. And this somewhat relates to what I just said. From your vantage point, as we think about these complex topics, are there any particular missing pieces that consumer advocates could really benefit from, including any that you think entities like RMI could lean in to help support? We really have an interest here in trying to provide useful resources, whether that's educational tools, what have you. And so, yeah, curious if there are things that feel like they would make your job and the jobs of your respective members a lot easier as it relates to grid planning for EVs.
As one piece of the puzzle, since forecasting is a large piece of this puzzle, I think that offices are at different levels of understanding with how to look at forecasting and engage about forecasting. So I think some training there could be helpful. But I think, as a former, I'm used to being a consumer advocate. If a utility came with me and says, we forecast, this kind of growth over the next 10 years, I'm not sure how to trust it. So I need tools to be able to sort of sanity check things that utilities give me. Not just understanding what a forecast is, but like, how do I test that? Mm-hmm. What are the assumptions that I need to be like poking at? What are the particular variables that I really should focus on? Like helping consumer advocates analyze utility applications would be helpful. Not just how do you look at a forecast, how do you understand a forecast, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Great. Well, I can't resist another plug here. Grid up EV load forecasting.
I'm like softballs.
Haven't checked it out. I'd recommend that you do, because I think you could answer a lot of those questions. Great. Well, Nina, I feel like we could talk for a lot longer, but I do want to be respectful of our other guests. So thank you so much both for joining today and for all of your engagement and support over the last couple of years. I'm sure we'll have more engagement going forward, but appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Of course. Hand it back over, I believe, to Hannah now.
Great. Thank you, Ben. let me just get myself and our speakers. Okay. Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Many of you probably know me by now, but my name is Hannah. I'm a senior associate on the RMI Carbon-Free Transportation team. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I'm really looking forward to this panel discussion here. Just as a reminder, we will be taking questions from the audience for the panelists towards the end of this session. So please feel free to start dropping questions in the chat or note them down to yourself and raise your hand at the end of the discussion. And we look forward to your questions. Aradhana, I think we can take down the slides and spotlight our speakers here. So I'm joined by two panelists today, Elizabeth from Alliance for Transportation Electrification, or ATE, and Richard from Cal Advocates. Both Elizabeth and Richard joined us in person for a consumer advocate convening that was co-hosted with ATE in January of this year. And we appreciate them being here to have this discussion with us today. I will ask you each to introduce yourself. Elizabeth, if you want to go ahead.
Great. Thanks, Hannah. As Hannah mentioned, my name is Elizabeth Turnbull. I am the Director of Policy and Regulatory Affairs for the Alliance for Transportation Electrification. We are a trade association of utilities and automakers and charging hardware and software manufacturers, all working towards an electrified future for transportation. Our primary place of intervention, and I say that like with a small I, is in the utility regulatory space. We don't formally intervene in dockets, but we do provide education and support our members, both utilities and non, in those dockets and proceedings, and work to educate commissioners on everything about transportation electrification, rate design, proactive planning, managed charging, all of the, and then utility programs as well. So all the bits and pieces that of where this transportation electrification movement touches the utility space.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, so hi everyone. I'm the supervisor of the distribution planning and policy team at the California Public Advocate's Office. We're the ratepayer advocate in California. I manage a team of 8 staff that looks at the distribution grid in California and anything that connects to it, which increasingly recently has been electric vehicles. And our topic today touches on a lot of what my team does. So I've been in this role for 5 years, and before that I worked for 20 years or so in Australia and other countries on other energy regulatory issues.
Thank you, Richard. Okay, to kick us off here, I'd love to hear from both of you. Having engaged in some of the most direct proceedings on how to plan the grid for EVs, what stands out to you as distinct about today's distribution system planning environment compared to times past? Richard, would you like to go first?
Sure, yeah. So I'll just say by way of background that we've been working on a new framework for proactive distribution planning in California for a couple of years, really, and that produced an outcome of a framework in December last year. So this topic that we're discussing today has been a really important part of my team's work and my own work over the past few years. And we are closely involved in the annual distribution planning work that the 3 big utilities do here in California. So it all ties in together. And I would say the thing that I'm seeing the most at the moment in the current environment is uncertain load growth. And it's already come up a little bit today. It's not as much of a steady trajectory in load growth anymore. We've got new technologies coming online. I know this is a talk about electric vehicles, and they're a large part of it, but clearly there's a lot of other technologies coming on board too, such as heat pumps. But in the EV space, there's a lot of changing happening. I think light-duty electric vehicles are perhaps at a more mature stage than electrification of fleets, and fleet operators are still working out how to best electrify their fleets. We're seeing political changes, both at a state level and federally, that are impacting this area, sending policy and regulations in new directions. And I'd say that what we need to do is be smart about how to best forecast and plan at this time of uncertainty. Clearly, getting our forecasts wrong could lead to infrastructure being built that isn't needed. And if that infrastructure is paid by ratepayers, it's ratepayers ultimately bearing the risk of getting forecasts wrong and doing our planning wrong.
Yeah, I would echo that. So yeah, I sort of had three bullet points on this, and uncertainty was one of them. I think for many of us in this space, the long-term outlook for transportation electrification is pretty clear, but the shorter-term outlook is significantly driven by policy and economics, and the directions that those swing has been all over the map for quite some time, but I would say particularly in the last 18 months, right? We've seen sort of federally the politics swing one way, and actually, with sort of geopolitics and war, we've seen some of the economics swing a different way. And so, that's just very, very challenging to predict right now. I think the other two things that I had here really were just load growth and the characteristics of that load, right? Like, we're seeing a different level of urgency and pacing, a different level of need with respect to speed to power. We're seeing industry engage in that question at the legislative and regulatory level in a new and different way. And then, I would say the sort of what I call the lumpiness of some of that load growth, right? Whether that's data centers that are sort of lumpy in terms of where they are spatially and geographically, or EVs, which have sort of lumpy load temporally, like throughout the day. So we're just not seeing that smooth sort of peanut butter load growth that we may have seen in the past. It's just not as diversified across space and time. And then I think also, and I think there's a really positive side of this, and also a less positive side. It's just a lot of skepticism around the costs and benefits of that load growth. We are clearly in an affordability moment, not just for energy. We're seeing it at the kitchen table. We're seeing it in the media. And we know that whatever the frameworks tell us about costs and benefits, a lot of the costs are now and a lot of the benefits are later. And I think that is creating a lot of uneasiness and a real sense that we need to get this right, as you said, Richard, right? Like, we've got to get the frameworks right so that we can not just capture upside opportunity, but also mitigate that downside risk. And that just adds a lot of tension and pressure to the conversation, which already, I think, as we know, and as Nina alluded to, isn't always the most trust. There isn't as much trust between different conversants in this conversation as maybe we wish there were.
Great, thank you both. You both touched on load forecasting, sort of the need for updates to load forecasting, both to understand new potential load growth and also perhaps to identify upgrade needs. What lessons have you learned from being involved in different forecasting processes? And what would you share with other advocates in the room from states that perhaps are not leveraging new data sets or methods for these forecasts yet that you have seen to be helpful?
You want me to start?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned, we've been working on a new proactive distribution planning framework. And to me, proactive planning really means planning in the face of uncertain load growth, a characteristic of the times we're in. A key part of what we have been working on is the customer data that the utilities may use to forecast load when they're doing their planning. We have a government agency here that's not the Public Utilities Commission, a separate government agency that has always produced this annual top-down statewide forecast of load growth. And that's traditionally been the way that the starting point for utilities planning the distribution grid. Utilities have now got more and more data coming in from customers on what's happening out there on the grid and in terms of load growth. And it's been a real challenge to work out how to fit together this traditional top-down forecast with bottoms up and perhaps more near-term information from customers, and try to make decisions around what levels of confidence has to be in that data, that data that utilities are getting from customers before the utilities can use that for planning. So throughout this work that we've done, there's a few lessons for me coming out of that. So I think the relationship between planning and cost recovery is important. So we have separate processes here in California, an annual planning process, and then a separate general rate case period that's proceeding a period that lasts for a couple of years. It's important to understand how planning then feeds into cost recovery. Here it's the GRC, and then how your approach to proactive planning might influence how utilities are allowed to recover costs in their GRC applications. And here in California, the new proactive planning framework is likely to underpin utility rate case applications. I've talked a bit about top-down forecasts and bottom-up data. As I said, we've traditionally used top-down forecasts in California based on things like econometric details like population growth. It's, I think, really difficult to stitch together a top-down framework with bottom-up data because it's very difficult to work out if specific loads that you're seeing in your bottoms-up data are actually already reflected in the system-wide forecast. And we don't have solutions to that yet. There's a number of bodies that are trying to work on that here, but just be cognizant of some of those challenges as you start to think about this space. I would suggest as another lesson is, particularly if you're getting into this world of bottom-up data, is to think about the different incentives that the different parties in this space have. So customers, it's becoming fairly clear, customers, and I'm thinking, for example, of developers of charging stations or fleets, appear to have an incentive to request as much grid capacity as possible, particularly if they're not paying for it. So if ratepayers are paying for the majority of the grid upgrades that utilities undertake, it seems fairly likely that customers will want to request grid capacity in their area so that when they come to energize their load, the capacity is there as needed. Utilities may not be the best at scrutinizing these applications for energization from new load. They may lack resources. They may not even care too much if they overbuild, since it's likely to grow their rate base. So I would just suggest thinking about proactive planning and just from the lines of who might benefit from different outcomes. As I said, think about the uncertainty that you're going to accept in terms of the level of data that can form the basis for planning. Clearly, if you're accepting very low confidence data, so that might be very early stage customer plans, for example, those customer plans may not eventuate. And of course, you could end up in a situation where you're overbuilding the grid, building the grid for a load that doesn't eventuate. And if ratepayers are funding that, then that looks like a risk and a burden on ratepayers. And finally, I think be cautious about committing to spending ratepayer dollars up front to get things like managed charging to work. I think we can all understand the benefits of managed charging and load shifting, but having a lot of capital expenditure funded by ratepayers happen at an early stage, so that represents a cost to ratepayers. It could also involve incentive programs that involve costs to ratepayers. It looks like a risk to me to have those costs up front and then the benefits occur down the track. And the sorts of benefits I'm thinking of are avoided distribution upgrades. Of course, whether a grid upgrade happens or not is within the control of the utility, and it just looks like a risk to ratepayers to be funding a lot of cost up front based on uncertain outcomes in terms of avoided grid upgrades that could be years into the future. So just think about that as you're approaching the space, and I think a robust cost-benefit analysis is often a good idea in the space. I've spoken for a long time there. There's a few different lessons. I'll hand over to Elizabeth.
Yeah, I think, as I look at this landscape and some of the lessons learned, again, I think those news sources of data are essential, right? EPRI has their GridFast tool, RMI has GridUp. We have sort of new and different places that utilities are getting data. That's I think in some ways in conflict with some transparency, just due to the proprietary nature of some of that data and the need for anonymity. And so that I'm seeing utilities kind of work that out of like, how do we draw that information out from our customers or prospective customers and share it appropriately with regulators and consumer advocates and other stakeholders without violating that that customers need to keep their data proprietary. And so, and that all feeds into, I think, exactly what you said, Richard, this process of knitting together the top down and bottom up forecasts and that whole process. And I think that is an area where utilities need to be very thoughtful in how they approach it and transparent about how they have approached it. I do think transparency here is essential about the models, the inputs, the analysis. I think we've seen this get tangled up in a couple of states where, a stakeholder or a regulator asks the utility to go back and like, okay, can you change a couple things in your model and give us a different output? Well, it's a living model. It's changed 1,000 times since we filed. No, we can't just go back and make a few adjustments. And so I think understanding the modeling software and what it can do, what it can't do, I think is important for everybody. It feels like there's something about transparency of the modeling that runs the risk of creating a tangle. And then the last thing I would add is just sort of scenario planning and sensitivity analyses, right? We're not running a single model. We need to make sure that we're gut checking all of this. And I think some of those data sources like GridFast and GridUp, we've seen utilities use those not as the basis of their model, but actually to verify what their model said, right? And so it's sort of that's acting as a gut check. So those different pieces that can come in and just sort of answer the question of, does this pass the LAF test, or is it all saying the same thing, or are we starting to see different things when we run it different ways, and what does that mean?
Great, thank you. You both touched on this a little bit, but as we think about how proactive planning fits into general planning processes, at the January convening, we discussed states that have the approach of considering proactive investments on an individual project basis, like a substation or a feeder upgrade, versus considering a portfolio of projects, which could include a mix of proactive with also traditional upgrade needs. Elizabeth, as someone that works across multiple states, what are you seeing as far as different approaches that states are taking? And would you say there are any lessons learned on things to avoid or winning models that should be highly considered?
Yeah, as I look at the proactive frameworks that we've seen, I definitely have some opinions about what's working best in practice and what isn't. But I think what's clear to me is that each of the frameworks has evolved from the specific state and the conditions under which it was sort of first ideated, right? And so, for example, in New York, we see project by project. That's how the approval is running, and it's not as a line, and that they get cost recovery approval like through that. It doesn't go through a GRC, and part of that is because New York had very significant enabling legislation, particularly around electrification of school buses, that was going to impact basically the utilities were going to start seeing the impact before they were authorized to file another GRC. And so so there was like this timeline misalignment and a strong policy. I think California is sort of doing more of this portfolio approach, integrating the data on the front end versus running sort of a separate analysis for proactive investments. And I think that probably is going to work for California. In Minnesota, it's project by project, and a lot of that is because there's this cost share element. So you have to know what project was implemented proactively, and then customers who come and plug into that project are going to share in the costs of that. And that was largely because a big part of their framework was driven by distributed generation as opposed to load. And so if it's distributed generation, then those customers or providers are paying for the distribution upgrades versus even in a reactive setting versus some of the load customers. So I think that it really depends on the state, the filing cadences, what the state is trying to achieve. And to me, that says that each state has to kind of undertake this on their own, within their own context. There's a lot we can learn across state lines, but there are a lot of differences as well. And if we just try to sort of port one framework from one state into a different state, then it's probably not going to work very well.
Thank you. Richard, as Elizabeth mentioned, California is taking the portfolio approach that I mentioned. Can you tell us a little bit more about that approach and what lessons your team has seen from that so far?
Well, I suppose as long as I've been involved in distribution here, it's always been a portfolio approach. And so it's hard for me to draw a distinction between portfolio and an individual approach. I feel like there are so many projects here that it would be very difficult to approach it on an individual project basis. And I'll say that there has been no attempt here in the proactive planning work, to try to segregate out the projects that are deemed proactive from those that aren't. Partly because for the higher voltage part of the distribution grid, it's difficult to attribute the need to build that to any one particular customer. So it's generally going to be shared across a number of different customers, which I think would make that difficult. So in the planning, we certainly see individual projects proposed. There are hundreds of those. And then individual projects do also form the basis of the later cost recovery in the general rate cases. But it's very rare that we engage with those on an individual level and try to challenge individual projects. It tends to be more the overall approach that the utility has taken. So I think I'll stop there, and yeah, that's the guide to California.
Thanks, Richard. As my last question here, I'm curious to hear from both of you what you think the single biggest opportunity is in the realm of grid planning for EVs, and what your final key message is out to our audience here. Elizabeth, do you want to go first?
Yeah. I do think that this, proactive investment in the grid as we look to a more electrified future is going to continue to expand across the country. When we met in January, we were looking at 3 frameworks in 3 different states. And since then, we've seen frameworks draft or final approved or come out in 2 additional states, New Jersey and Washington, just last week. And so I think that I don't think this issue is going to go away. I loved hearing Nina say that she went from being an extreme skeptic to sort of understanding more deeply through conversation why proactive investment is important. And I think we'll continue to see it. And I think my greatest hope is that it doesn't get this conversation about EV load doesn't get too tangled with conversation about large loads, which for a variety of reasons are very, very different as they come onto the grid than EV load, both in terms of where they hit physically, distribution versus transmission level, as well as the type of load they bring, the level of capitalization of the companies that are coming onto the grid in those different scenarios, and the level of value that those two types of loads bring to society.
Yeah, I love this space. I think it's such an interesting area to work in. I think it's a fascinating time to be working at the junction of the energy industry and transportation. I'd say I think the biggest opportunity seems to be the potential for downwards pressure on rates that I think Nina mentioned earlier. If we can do our planning and build out of the grid, the distribution grid in the right way. So I think that means being smart about how we build out the grid, not building assets that are underutilized, not overbuilding, and as much as we can, shifting load away from the peak. So, and yeah, hopefully that produces a downwards pressure on rates by having a greater load through electrification, but spreading that over a proportionally smaller number of amount of fixed costs. And in terms of a final key message, and again, perhaps echoing what Nina said earlier on about trust. I guess I try to stay as close as possible to the utilities that we work with, and the customers, as to understand what they're doing in terms of building out new loads. So I just think that's you don't always get all of your information through formal channels, and anything that you can do to keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening, what the utilities are thinking of, what other government bodies are doing as they think about improving their load forecasts, what the customers are doing. I think that can only help you in this fast-paced and uncertain world. So I'll use that as my final message.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the audience? Please feel free to drop them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and come off mute and ask any questions.
In the absence of other questions, I'll ask a softball here. Would you or would you not recommend that your fellow consumer advocates, Richard, attend an RMI convening if the opportunity presents itself in the future?
I attended my first RMI event in person earlier this year. I found it a good experience, both in terms of learning what other states were doing and being able to share what was happening in California.
Great. Glad to hear it. Any other questions from our attendees here?
Hearing none. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Richard. Really appreciate your time and your insights.
Yeah, really appreciate it, Hannah.
No problems.
Aradhana, we can go back to the slides.
Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button. Okay. Great. Thank you, Hannah, Elizabeth, and Richard for that discussion, and Ben and Nina as well. All right, so for the second last activity here, we are hoping to make this a little more interactive and have folks exchange ideas about what they've heard, where they see this fitting into their daily lives in the next 15 minutes. So we'll send you out into breakout groups within Zoom in the next minute here. And we really encourage you to think back on the material that's been shared throughout the previous webinars, the conversations that you've heard today, and for those of you who've attended the convenings, the conversations you've had there. And think of kind of these two questions here, but you're welcome to go beyond that. One is, how can you implement the insights that you've seen from all of this work in your day-to-day, especially as it pertains to grid planning for EVs? And second, are there any resources or other ways, other methods of support that we haven't included here that would be valuable to you? We'd love to hear that as well. And finally, please identify a volunteer who'd be happy to give a brief, 1 to 2 minute share out from your group by the end. So I will just send everyone into breakout rooms. And they are open now.